Oh, yes. So good evening, everybody. It's been a little bit of a roller coaster. Last Thursday we continued honoring our Aleph Bet, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, with letter Mem. Rowan Pitlock is right here. She gave us a splendid vision of what letter Mem looks like. And then we went to Shabbat and we left Shabbat with Selihot. And now is Motzai Shabbat and is Sunday. And we are delighted that Larry Garber is with us for many, many reasons. Among others, because I was trying to remember how much I remember about letter Nun. Right, but nevertheless, we are here. So I see that there's somebody put right. So what we're gonna do is what we always do, which is I'm going to share the screen so we can go into Adona Selichot, and we're going to be looking at this line that begins with letter Mem, Male Zachiot, Nora Teilot. Nora Teilot, some of you remember from the introduction to the Amidah on Shabbat, right? And the Pismon, the refrain that we sing together throughout the Selichot time. חטאנו לפניך רחם עלינו, חטאנו לפניך רחם עלינו, מלא זכיות נורא תהילות, סולח עוונות עונה בצרות, חטאנו לפניך רחם עלינו, חטאנו לפניך רחם עלינו. And our particular line, Nora Teilot, reminds us that the days that go from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur are called Yamim Noraim, as this word with the nun reminds us. Some people translate it as terrible, some people translate as awe, some people translate as fear. In any case, in here is combined with the idea of Teilot, of praises. Remember not to confuse with Tehillim, the 150 Psalms, but Tehilot, the praises that we offer. And so what I'm going to do now is to remind ourselves, or our speaker for tonight, and I want to tell you that that our speaker for letter Nun is Larry Garber, and Larry is an extraordinary, humble person with an incredible resume. But among just a few things that he led me to know, he's an international development and elections expert who has worked for USAID and various non-governmental organizations. He's also a longtime member of the Farbrengen Chavura. And with those words, I'm delighted to have Larry with us. And Larry, if you can bring your camera on. I'm going to spoil it. Oh, there you are. I see you in two different places. Maybe it's the idea of Nora that makes you appear in two different places, but here you are. It's the floor is all yours.
Okay, so let me remove one of those. Okay, now, okay, now can you see me, Ramon?
I can see you beautifully.
Okay, now you should only see one of me. First of all, thank you, Ramon, for inviting me to participate in the Selihot series, and I sincerely apologize for almost giving you a heart attack, but this has been on my calendar ever since you arranged or invited me, and so I'm very excited to be here. I first attended Selihot services as a young boy, and always felt that it marked the start of the high holiday season. However, I never really paid much attention to the specifics of the prayers, or do I have memories of particular tunes that have stayed in my head. And probably you would not want to hear my efforts to sing any of them in any event. In addition to not being musically inclined, I'm not a linguist or an expert on the Hebrew alphabet, as some of the folks who have spoken before me clearly are. Nonetheless, I chose the letter Nun for a particular reason, and I appreciate my good friend Norman Shaw agreeing to trade Nun for Samach, which you will hear about tomorrow night from Norman. Let me also say, by way of introduction, that I am dedicating this presentation to my cousin Gail's husband, Pinchas Solo, who was killed last Sunday night in a car accident on a back road in New Jersey, returning from davening Mincha Ma'ariv while on vacation. By all accounts, Pinchas was a wonderful soul, and may his memory be for a blessing to his family and to his friends. When I think of the letter Nun, the following names and words come to my mind. Nun is the name of Joshua's father. His name is repeated frequently in the Old Testament, Yehoshua ben Nun, but we learn basically nothing about him from the texts. Nun is also one of the 4 letters that appears on the dreidel that forms part of the Hanukkah celebration. In the gaming tradition that certainly I was brought up with, landing on Nun is neither a benefit or a loss, a neutral outcome, which is, to be fair, sometimes just what we actually need. Nun is also the first letter in Nisan, the first month of the new year, according to the Jewish calendar. But this too is quite an anomaly, because most of us associate Rosh haShana as the beginning of the new year. And I'm not going to get into the exegesis of the different New Years that we celebrate as part of the tradition. Nun is also the first letter of the word Nazir, an ascetic, whose commitments and responsibilities are described most prominently in the biblical portion of Naso, another word beginning with Nun. Nazir is represented in the Old Testament by the figure of Shimshon, an enigmatic figure, to say the least. I want to focus on another word that begins with Nun, and that is Nezer, or crown. That word formed part of the moniker for my great-grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Rosen. The full moniker is Nezer HaKodesh, or sanctified crown, which is the title of several Sfarim, or books of commentary that he wrote on different tractates of the Talmud. If you can see here, I'm holding up a copy of Nezer HaKodesh that was compiled, put together by one of my relatives several years ago, and this one includes his commentary on 6 different Mesechet of the Talmud. Today, if you look up Nezer HaKodesh on Wikipedia, you're likely to be referred initially to a YouTube presentation regarding preparations for the restoration of the Third Temple, which in my mind is a quite unfortunate association. Similarly, if you look up Rabbi Moshe Rosen on Wikipedia, the first reference is likely to be to Moshe Rosen, who founded Jews for Jesus and died in 2010. The second reference will be to a Rabbi Moshe Rosen, who served as the chief rabbi of Romania from 1948 to 1994. That is, during the period of communist rule in his country, and his relationships with the communist authorities was both lauded for the protections he provided to his community and criticized for the accommodations that he had to make with those very same authorities. My grandfather is the third person you will find on the Wikipedia list. He was born in Poland in 1870, but moved to Lithuania in the late 19th century to become the rabbi of Kvedan, a small town about 20 miles outside of Vilna. He married a woman by the name of Hinda Trivash, the daughter of Hillel David Trivash, who was the editor of the magazine HaPeska, which is described as an anti-Haskalah or an anti-enlightenment journal. In Kvedan, he befriended a young man by the name of Avraham Yeshaya Karelitz, who later years was known as the Chazon Ish, and who became a leader of the Haredi community in Israel after he made Aliyah in 1933. According to various sources, he was acting in protecting his community, often rescuing people from the forced and mandatory labor that was imposed upon members of the community on the Shabbat. At the beginning of World War I, the Eastern Front of the war between Germany and Russia passed right through Kvedan and its environs, and most of the Jews fled to avoid the battlefront. Since no other rabbi was nearby, the Nezer HaKodesh remained in the area to oversee the needs of the extended Jewish community. After the war, he emigrated to the United States in the early 1920s and became a leader of the Agudas Harabanim, one of the main Orthodox rabbinical groups, as well as a congregational rabbi in Brownsville, which is a section of Brooklyn, and which at the time was a major Jewish hub. In addition to writing several books of commentary, he also was a posek, and his tshuvot were also published in a couple of volumes. He died in 1957, 2 years after serving as the sanduk at the circumcision of his oldest, and at the time only, great-grandchild. Yours truly. As a child, I had a book which I can no longer find, which was a compilation of stories about prominent Orthodox rabbis in the first half of the 20th century. And this book included a 2-page chapter on my great-grandfather. In 7th grade, my Talmud teacher at the modern Orthodox Jewish day school that I attended, who had studied with my great-grandfather, learned of my connection and tried to convince my parents to send me to a more yeshivish school, warning them and me that I would otherwise become what he called a stick in the mud. As my interests at the time were much more focused on being the point guard for our school's basketball team, my parents did not push the matter. After many years, even decades, of not thinking about him or what he represented, my mother's passing almost 3 years ago has drawn me again to his biography. In addition, my older son, Alex, did a genealogy project for school, the Jewish Day School in Rockville, and incorporated my mother's memory of her grandfather into his presentation. More recently, he has been studying the introduction, the Hakdama, and excerpts from the book Nezer HaKodesh with one of the rabbis at the University of Maryland, where he is now a senior. So are there lessons from his life and teachings that have consciously or perhaps subconsciously influenced me? Let me share a few anecdotes, lessons, answers to questions that I've come across over time. Somewhat unique for his time and his Haredi background, my great-grandfather was a religious Zionist. Ironically, he moved to the United States, while his disciple and friend, the Chazon Ish, an anti-Zionist, moved to Israel. Still, I think he would be proud that 2 of his 9 grandchildren, including my mother, made Aliyah, and more than 14 of his great-grandchildren now live in Israel. And while I am frequently critical of Israeli policies, I have always been a believer in the importance of there being a state that can provide refuge to Jews in trouble and can serve as an Or Leumim, a light for the nations. My great-grandfather also was a humanist. My son describes the following passage that he learned with his rabbi from the introduction of the Nezer HaKodesh. Jews should not think that they are better or worse than other people because the tradition designates them as a chosen people. Instead, we have to view all people as existing on an equal playing field, because otherwise we will end up being subjected to them when they are in power, or serve as their oppressors. By being chosen, we have to hold ourselves to operating at a higher moral standard and act accordingly. This message resonates not only when I think of my personal view about Judaism, but indeed my feeling as an American who is committed, as Ramon suggested in the introduction, most of his professional career to working overseas, and who must constantly avoid the temptation to think that I belong to a higher culture or higher political entity just because I grew up and live now in the United States. We too must learn that our democracy and society need to be constantly perfected. Finally, at least some of his psaks, his rulings in very specific cases, suggest a pragmatic orientation. He was once asked the following: some of the ladies who attend our shul are now aging, and it is difficult for them to climb the steps to the Ezras HaNashim, the lady section. As you can imagine, many of the shuls, even in Brooklyn, in those days had a downstairs for the men and an upstairs balcony for the women. So the question was, may we take part of the downstairs men's section, place a bechitza between it and the men, and make it into an auxiliary women's section? I won't get into all the details of the tradition and why this is such a difficult question for some of the rabbis, but my great-grandfather concluded, unlike several other very prominent poskim, that a change was permissible, but that the women's section should be slightly higher than the men's section so that there would be no confusion as to which was which. Obviously, for many of us, the idea of a segregated seating itself is problematic, and the answer may seem somewhat retrograde. But in the context of the time and the milieu in which he was operating, it reflected a pragmatism that is lacking not only in Haredi religious circles, but also, to my sincere sadness, in some of our secular traditions. I also remember my father, who I would call the epitome of Young Israel orthodoxy, Young Israel being the movement that he was very proud to be part of, but he was in no way a scholar or a learned person. But he described my great-grandfather's reaction to his and my mother's telling him, my great-grandfather that is, that there would be mixed dancing at their wedding. According to my father, and he loved to tell the story, Rav Moshe told everyone, for a wedding, we must defer to the choices of the Chatan and Kala, the groom and bride. Although I'm sure he said Chassan and Kala. The pictures from the wedding show an enthusiastic group of participants engaging in mixed dancing, with at the same time a table filled with rabbis engaged in solemn discussions. Pragmatism has been the guiding light for my own work. It is easy to become fixated on ideology, but in truth, we all operate in an environment of less than perfect knowledge. Whether considering withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war, or how to support the earthquake-devastated communities in Haiti, or how to broker a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, our responses must be based on examining the situation from multiple perspectives, not only what we bring to the table, but what those who are living on the ground are experiencing day to day, and then designing and implementing a response that has the potential for maximum benefit and minimum harm. But just framing the proposition in this manner highlights that we accept that we may be wrong and that we must assume the responsibility for the consequences. Let me close my presentation with one other word that begins with nun. Nirtzah, which we all know is the last section of the Pesach Haggadah. According to one interpretation, Nirtzah connotes the following. The steps of the Seder have been integrated into our consciousness and accepted. Now we pause, take a deep breath, and reflect on our experience. We examined our personal challenges through the slavery of our ancestors, and we achieved a personal freedom by reliving the Exodus. We completed our part in good faith. The season of Selichot represents a different type of opportunity to pause, take a deep breath, and reflect on our experiences of the past year, as well as to look forward to the coming year. I wish everyone a Shana Tova Umetuka, a happy and sweet new year. Let us work toward living up to the moral standards that we believe are critical to us personally and to our ability to contribute to a better society. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova to you too, Larry. Tiskele mitzvot. May you have the opportunity to continue performing as many mitzvot as the one that you have taught us tonight, reminding us of the power of zichronot, of remembrance, in such a fundamental way as you have, remembering your grandfather, your father, your family, all of it. And also to remind us that something very interesting about the letter Nun, which reminds us that in Hebrew we conjugate verbs, adding this letter Nun to the first person plural in the future. And perhaps this is also another of the teachings that you have given us tonight, to remind us that in order to look for the future, we need to do it together, and with the pragmatism that you indicated. And finally, let me also say, in connecting you, I'm sure you would agree with me, that where we're looking at so many places of the Tefillah, and especially about Psalm 145, where we find the words, when we get in the acrostic beginning with Aleph and going all the way to Taf, that the letter Nun is actually not indicated but we have Somech Noflim. Somech, the letter that we're going to be celebrating tomorrow night, and Noflim as part of your presentation, Larry, that I'm glad you did not want to focus on. But I will say to all of you that since Shirat HaNefesh is partnering with Jewish United for Justice, and they are actually working very diligently, those of you that were at Selihot Ashkenazi version last night probably remember Laura Wallace from Jewish United for Justice, and how we were talking about the federal situation as impacting us in Maryland, and the actions that are related to renters' rights coalitions. I like to put on the chat this link inviting everybody to actually to participate in the action of bringing those that are noflim, as they happen to be, that after the Supreme Court has denied or canceled the moratorium for those that rent and perhaps are in a very low situation economically and spiritually, I'm sure, that we can read on this and act and forcefully remind our elected leaders to come forward and ameliorate this very difficult situation. So thank you, Larry, very much for bringing us into the spirit of Selihot, and to connect the letter Nun not only to the beautiful words that the Nezer and the crowns and the Nirtzah and so many other beautiful connections you had, but also to give us the opportunity to get to know you better and to get to know your family better through your Jewish life. So until then, I want to say that tomorrow night we'll continue this time with, as you guessed, with the letter Samech, with another of our friends, Norman Shore, who actually begins with a Nun, as Norman, right? One could say. And Fran Levin is saying, thank you, Larry, for introducing us to your family and the links that continue to grow across the oceans, inspiring, teaching, and connecting roots, thoughts, and actions pertinent today. Thank you for bringing us a new view of the letter Nun. So we'll continue tomorrow night at 8 o'clock with the letter Samech. I hope that all of you and the more than 260 people that have registered for this Selihot series continue supporting them. And until then, I say to all of you, Laila Tov. May you have a wonderful, restoring rest of the evening. And before that, I see that Jake, in his profound technological knowledge, has raised his hand. So I want to give you the very last word, Jake.
That's a mistake. I should lower it. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, nevertheless, we should all raise our hands to continue studying and uplifting ourselves during this Cheshbon HaNefesh. Nefesh, the word that also begins with Nun, the accounting of our souls. Until then, Laila Tov to all of you. See you, as always, tomorrow night.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.